Hello, welcome to Sustainable Leadership Live. I'm Lisa Danforth, your host, and today I have the delightful Dr. Cheri Hampton-Farmer. She's going to be telling us about sharing all sorts of tips and tools and insights on how to increase our influence through speaking up. Now, I say, Cheri, let's just jump right in and start talking. If you want to share a little bit about you and how you came about this, I'd love to hear and share it with the audience.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for having me. I'm excited to be here today. I came into this idea of talking about influence and leadership when I was frustrated in meetings, and I noticed people sitting there who had great ideas, very smart, intelligent people, but they sat there and said nothing. And right, yeah. So I was very interested in looking at what makes them be quiet and what could we do to help more people working in meetings, working in organizations speak up. And there are some very simple steps and tools that people can use to increase their influence. And so I started packaging that, doing training and coaching, and love what I'm doing now.
And what a gift, right? It's we're often taught to sort of not speak up, or maybe we've been sort of tapped down a little bit and then we've learned not to speak up. But how do we increase that influence without sharing our knowledge, sharing what we're passionate about? I say let's chat a little bit about what is influence. What is it and what is it not? If you could share that.
Well, it's so abstract and people use it in so many different ways. And I think of it as a continuum. There's gentle nudging all the way to manipulation. But if we're using ethical communication, we're not going to even step inside of that manipulation, right? So if our ethics persuade us to do what's in the best interest of other people, we're not going to go in that direction. So the sweet spot is a little more than gentle nudging, but I also want to kind of define it by showing you that people have influence. All of us have some degree of influence, and we choose to use it in different ways. One example of this is a gentleman who was in a university where I taught, was on the national championship basketball team, and they had an undefeated season, Division II, and he had sat the bench for the whole game. This was the last game. The game went into overtime. They were neck and neck, and the star player fouled out, and Tyler Evans jumped in, made a three-point shot just as after the buzzer rang. His shot, made the basket, and won. And that gentleman had influence. And he had influence because he showed up every day, consistent, practiced with the team, and he was able to use his influence in that last moment. And I like to say we all have influence like that. We may not be doing grandiose things, but we're showing up every day consistently, contributing and being prepared. So I like to think of influence in terms of we all have it. We cultivate it and we use it when we need it. It's there when we need it. Sometimes I like to think of it as a dial on volume. You can turn up the volume, you can turn up your influence when you need more, and you can turn it down when you need less. So that's one of the ways that I define influence.
I absolutely love that analogy, metaphor of just turning up the dial. I talk about that with that inner critic, right? If you reach out and visually turn down the dial. Here's my thing. For those who have a difficult time speaking up and turning up the dial, what are some skill sets or habits that you could invite them to start stepping into to increase their comfort level in speaking up and their influence?
Great question. And it's something that I talk about in my 7 Steps to Speaking Up program. And they're very small steps. And they start with very simple things that we all know how to do. We have to just be mindful of doing them, being intentional. So for example, one of the most simple things you can do when you're in a meeting is to respond to someone. When they ask a question, a lot of times we hear crickets. Nobody wants to say anything first. Be the first one to speak up. And if you do that consistently, people are going to pay attention. They're going to actually look for you to answer. So speak up first, and then speak up frequently. I was working with a client recently. I said, when you're in a meeting, make sure you're the first person up. There'll be lots of opportunities and nobody likes that dead air time. So speak up first, speak up frequently. Also, some other things, just little tweaks we can do just to exert our influence, asking questions. Now, this may seem like a passive uh, trait, but it actually is very powerful. When you ask questions, you first of all show that you're interested, you show that you're listening, and sometimes you can use a question to guide the conversation. So if you want it to go in a different direction, it's very powerful. So it's not passive. So those are very small things. Other things that we can do is, as I said, speak up first, but also initiate ideas. If you're the one that has an idea, put it out there. If somebody else has to come up with another idea, or at least your idea is on the table. One example I like to use is in my small group communication class. I wanted to help students look at team member roles. So I put them in a fishbowl, not a literal fishbowl, but a fishbowl where outside people could observe, right? And I gave them each a role to play. And this particular day, it was a smaller group, so I had to give them more than one role so that we could get through all the roles. And one of the gentlemen, I gave him initiator, information gatherer, and his name was Lee. And I noticed that he was initiating, he was asking for information, gathering information. And at the end of it, I debriefed and I said, who was the leader in this group? And he didn't even have the slip of paper that said leader, but everybody said Lee because of his communication, right? So he was initiating conversation. He was asking for information. He was helping summarize. And one really cool thing I noticed in this little experiment was I noticed Lee's confidence building. You could see it in his posture as people were kind of looking to him and he was getting all this information. He just got more into his role, right? So those are just little things we can do that not only impact our influence, but help us be perceived as leaders.
I love that on so many levels. And it's really what I really heard you say, two things, was building the muscle, building the habit of speaking up, because it's uncomfortable. So it's something that we need to start stepping into to own it, but go small at first. So it's not too much, stepping out there. So it's too scary. But also everyone wants to be seen and heard. And when we ask those questions, I agree with you. It's not passive whatsoever. It's inviting conversation. It's having people step forward. We're speaking up by creating the space for someone to share something that they're working on or that, what they want to influence as well. Absolutely love that.
And I know your podcast is about sustainable leadership and you talk about boundaries. And oftentimes one of the reasons people don't speak up is because if they're speaking up because they're challenging an idea, and that's uncomfortable, right? We don't want people to get angry with us. We don't want that contention. So we just don't say anything. And I believe fully in equipping everyone in the organization to challenge ideas. That's the way we get the best decisions. And if we have a culture of supportive communication, first of all, but then the ability to challenge it in the right way so it's not damaging to people's egos, but we're challenging the ideas. And it's really healthy for the whole organization. I was in a situation in a meeting in which we were making a decision about whether to spend $1 million. And two people in the room were ranking 2 ranks higher than I am, and really didn't facilitate the meeting and allowed one individual to kind of take over the whole meeting. And this individual just really dominated the whole conversation and began to talk about things, the program that we had been working on, made all these claims about it. And I just had, I was going to say something. I was just waiting for him to take a breath. And then he finally said something about, well, he disparaged the other people in the room. In fact, many of the people in the whole organization. That was my limit. But it was in a situation, it's hard to stop him in mid-sentence, but I used nonverbals, my posturing, and I spoke up and I said, wait a minute, that is not the experience I had. That's not accurate information, because we all didn't have that same experience. Now, it's difficult. I don't know why somebody else in the room didn't say anything, but it's difficult to speak up like that. And so I believe the organization decided not to sponsor this particular initiative. But what it taught me was, again, this has happened multiple times. Oftentimes, you're speaking up for other people.
Mhm.
And other people may be afraid to speak up because they don't want to lose their jobs, or the boss is in the room and they want to stay on good terms with the boss.
Staying
So
safe.
yes, yes. So speaking up and building that culture of speaking up. In fact, oftentimes in groups and meetings, I'll just say, okay, I'll be the devil's advocate. And that's kind of a safe way of saying, I'm going to challenge this idea. I still like all of you people, but I'm going to challenge this idea so we come up with a good decision.
I love what you're doing there is leading by example and speaking up. Like that is such a perfect, subtle example of that. And thank you for sharing the story of some. It is hard to speak up when someone is dominating the conversation. What do we do as someone who wants to create more influence, but we're tentative with speaking up in an environment like you were just explaining? Like, can you give a couple of different tips or tools or skills that someone could lean into that would allow them to push past that fear?
Mhm. Well, one of the first things I talk about is listening. And I know that sounds passive too, but it is so strong to be a good listener. And I tell clients that I work with, if you're listening so intently, so just listen in the group, you're going to be the smartest person in the room, right? You've heard all the conversations, you're retaining it, you might be taking notes. So listening is really impactful. Another way to increase your influence, as I said, questions, but summarizing. Just kind of jumping in. If even if you don't have a thought or you can't think of a question, jumping in and say, "So we've been talking about this. I just want for clarification. Is this what we all agree that this means?" So summarizing a conversation is very powerful. Yeah,
So good.
yeah. And I guess one other thing is if you're afraid to challenge an idea,
Mhm.
a softer way, indirect way of challenging an idea is to ask questions that get everybody to think about uh, the issues in front of them. Oftentimes, people it's real easy to go, especially if you don't have a lot of time. It's easy to just go along with what everybody's talking about. But if somebody takes the time to formulate good questions, then I think that's a great way to exert your influence.
Listening and questions will absolutely change the dynamic of any conversation that you're in. And I do believe that truly allows you to step into that leadership. Great tips, skill sets, habits, whatnot. Can you talk about the importance of influence as a leader? Now, this may sound kind of silly, but just that was one thing that we had talked a little bit about in the green room, that influence. Take that and run with it, if you would, a little bit, the importance of that with a leader.
So the importance of influence with a leader. So if you think about the definition, this continuum of gentle nudging to manipulation, and ethical communication would deem that we're not manipulative, right? So we are trying to, as leaders, we are trying to model things for other people, as you mentioned, and we're trying to support other people so that they are free to be the best versions of themselves, to find their voice and to use it. So I think the modeling what a good leader is, using that influence. I always talk about use your influence for good. We can use it for evil, to be manipulative, and for things that are not good. But always having that intention of using your influence, your impact for good. Oftentimes, I'll say, people sometimes want to use their influence. They need to gain cooperation. I say, shine the spotlight on someone else. Let them share the spotlight with you. So if you're getting all this attention, if you already have influence, bring somebody along and give them some of your influence. Share that with them. So those are some of my ideas about how influence works in leadership. I have millions more, but we don't have time on this podcast.
Well, what you were saying is just so very important of highlighting someone else. I think that creates influence. It shows leadership. It shows curiosity. We have a LinkedIn user, I'm not sure who it is, who's saying listening is a superpower for sure. It is. How, and thank you for that, whoever it is. Because how do we, the listening skills, right? If we're not used to it, if we just sort of jump in, what are some of the ways that we can start with that? And I know that, again, that may sound a little silly, but listening is a true skill. It's a habit. It's a muscle that we need to be building.
Right. So I have a whole module on listening, so I'll make it really brief. But first of all, just set your intention to be a good listener. And to do that, you have to remove barriers. So what are the distractors? Are cell phones a distractor?
Mhm.
Know what your distractions are to be a good listener. When my husband comes in the door and I'm on the computer typing, I have to literally put my hands on my lap, turn and look at him so that I pay attention to him, or I'm not listening. I'm still engrossed in what I'm doing with the computer. So removing distractions, knowing what those are and removing them. And then, as I said, setting your intention. So it could be, I take notes. Even if I'm on a phone call, I take notes. And I'm very intentional about wanting to remember things. And if that helps you remember, there are multiple styles for listening, but oftentimes we are trying to listen for recall. And I think, especially in organizations and as leaders, we want to remember, we want to listen to be able to recall things so that we can use that information later on. And so some of the ways that we could do that is, again, set our intention, remove those distractions, know what those distractions are, and then lean into that listening.
I love that. Asking questions as a way to subtly challenge an idea. So very important because it creates that safe space
Mhm.
for people to explore, to share their ideas, and be able to meet the other person
Right.
in the middle. I absolutely love that. I'm really hearing what you're saying is leadership, internal, external, with family, with friends, everything that you're saying seems like it is, we create influence in every different area of our life. It's not just leadership and it's not just corporate when we can lean into it.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Communication knows no bounds, and we use it in every area of our life. So listening and influence are certainly visible in every area of our lives.
So every area, and let's bring this back to the corporate world with that influence and the culture. How do we create that influence, that culture in an area that may not have it?
Okay. So creating a culture, you reward things that are about you value, right? So
Mhm.
in academia, research is valued. So they reward that with promotion and tenure. In an organization, some organizations value working overtime and not being asked to be compensated. So that's valued. So that's what they reward. So that's part of their culture. But if we want to reward people supporting one another and sharing ideas, I know one organization actually values entrepreneurial spirit within the organization, and they actually give them time, so much time during the week to iterate, just come up with some new idea, and then they reward them financially if that idea is implemented. So the things that are rewarded are certainly reflective of the values of the organization and become part of the culture. So anything that's rewarded, anything that's repeated, I collected data from an organization, and things that were really important to them were learning. And I heard this from every person I interviewed and every person that I observed on the manufacturing line. They were so proud if they had learned to work on another machine. These machines were millions of dollars, and they took great pride in saying, I know how to work on that machine and that machine, because if somebody were sick and they could plug in to their spot, they didn't have to shut down the line. And of course, time was very important in that organization. So that was certainly a value. It was rewarded if they got degrees, if they did cross training, they were rewarded public praise or financial rewards. And so anything that's rewarded is going to be part of the culture.
And what I'm really hearing is that increases that intrinsic motivation for us to even want to do more, invite more conversation, learning more. That's so very important in influence, culture, all of it. This has been phenomenal. Thank you for sharing. You've got so many different tips, and you said you've got a course as well. I got to check that out. But believe it or not, we're just about at time. I would love to ask you, what is one habit or boundary that has supported you in living and leading a sustainable life?
Thank you for asking that question, Lisa. I would have to say it goes back to listening. It's something that doesn't come easily for most of us, and because we do it all the time, but to be intentional and mindful of listening and knowing what my boundaries are and really leaning in, showing interest in another person, and not just for the recall, but to see how I could help meet their needs. It's so important for me. It's a habit I'm still working on, but it's something I think about every day.
I really heard just that internal leadership, right? Like you wanting that and that intentionality.
Right.
And that is showing up as who you want to be is far more sustainable. I love that. Thank you so much. Where can people find you, reach out to you, connect with you? Where are the best places?
Well, LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn at Cheri Hampton-Farmer, and it's Cheri with a C. I have a website, www.communicating-matters.com. So that I had to buy the URL with the dash in it. And then my email is Cheri with a C at communicating-matters.com.
Beautiful. Thank you. And if you reach out to Dr. Cheri on LinkedIn, please be sure, or on Facebook or YouTube, please be sure to mention that you saw her here on Sustainable Leadership Live. This has been phenomenal. Thank you. Thank you. I so appreciate it. And next week, October 5th, can't believe it, we're into Halloween month. We have Stephanie Delfonso talking about goodbye anxiety, hello freedom. So join us next Wednesday, 10 a.m. East Coast, 7 a.m. Pacific, for a wonderful conversation on letting go of that anxiety. Dr. Cheri, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right,
I
take
enjoyed
care.
being here.
Bye.